Why play Experiment? Well, you have an AD opener or a Guinsoo slammed early. You want to play a flexible 4-cost comp that doesn't require many conditions and uses AD items. You have a strong Experiment opener where you can either reroll Experiment units or cap out very high with an emblem. Or you have a spatula or frying pan that you can either use to tempo or cap your board very high in the late game. However, units are often very contested with Experiment, especially in the current meta. It can be very hard to hit and win, and the reroll especially is very contested because typically Urgot is a unit that is bought by many different boards. Additionally, even though it's a flexible 4-cost comp, the main carry is very narrow, so it is still possible to miss and have a hard time stabilizing around the comp on level 8. Additionally, because of the trait Experiment, there are hexes that you are forced to place your units on, which makes it very easy for opponents to position against you, giving a lot of difficult fights later in the game if you're trying to win out. This is my channel, Fenrir Gaming. If you like my content, please make sure to like and subscribe. I know a lot of you aren't subscribed. Also, I have a significantly lower than average amount of people that slam the notification bell, so please make sure to like, subscribe, and also hit the notification bell if you do like my content and you watch me daily. So, what is Experiment? Let's go over the trait, and then I'll talk about the units, and then I'll show you some boards as well as some early game options in order to play the trait. When we're talking about Experiment, basically what happens is you gain laboratory hexes on your board. These hexes will appear with a little green outline, and then by placing experiments in the laboratory hexes, they gain experiment bonuses. The units that are on the hexes, they will gain the experiment bonuses of all the other units that are on the hexes. We'll go over the experiment bonuses after, but each unit, if you read their description of their ability, will have a little section that says experiment bonus and will list out their experiment bonus. So when you have 3 experiments in, you basically get an extra bit of health for every single one of the units that is on an experiment hex, and then you also get these hexes, so these 2 laboratory hexes that will share their experiment bonuses with each other. When you have 5 experiments in, then you'll get 3 hexes and a little bit more HP, and then 7 increases the experiment bonuses by 100%. So if you're wondering what the experiment bonuses look like, these are all the experiment bonuses. I kind of just condensed them and put them all on one slide. So the writing is a little bit small, but I'll go over each unit and say what their experiment bonus is. And then later when we talk about the boards, I'll talk about some of the better experiment bonus pairings for different boards. So Zyra's experiment bonus is that she gives ability damage bleeds enemies for 50% true damage over 2 seconds. Urgot's experiment bonus is that he dashes to targets and on cast, gain 8% max health shield and 20% attack speed for 5 seconds. For Nunu and Willem, after dealing damage, deal 3% max HP as bonus magic damage on a 1-second cooldown. And Dr. Mundo's, you gain 120 max health and on each takedown, gain 60 more max health. For Twitch, the experiment bonus is after every 5 attacks, deal physical damage to the nearest enemy equal to 15% of their max health. And Warwick, who is a 6-cost, experiment bonus is that on kill, stun enemies adjacent to dead target for 1.5 seconds. Additionally, if you get an experiment emblem, the unit that is holding the experiment emblem will grant the experiment bonus of, after 8 seconds or on death, summon a copy of this unit with 60% max health. So basically, whenever you have experiment bonuses, the main thing you should note is that every experiment unit that is on an experiment hex. So for example, with 3 experiment, you'll be able to select 2 of your units to get the experiment bonuses. Those 2 units will gain both experiment bonuses. And then in 5 experiment, you'll have 3 hexes. Those 3 units will gain all 3 experiment bonuses, which are provided by the units. So for example, if you put Urgot on a hex and Zyra on a hex, then both Urgot and Zyra will gain the 2 bonuses of ability damage bleeding and dashing to targets with max health shield, for example. And then if you have 5 experiment in and you put it in Nunu, then all 3 of them will have ability damage bleeding, dashing to targets, and giving max HP as bonus magic damage. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a little bit confusing, but we'll talk about it a little bit more when we go through the actual boards. So, when should you play Experiment? There's not that many conditions. It's actually became a lot more relevant in the current patch, which is really good timing for this video that I didn't make an Experiment video last patch that it wasn't as relevant. But basically, a lot of times, if you're playing around a 4-cost unit like Twitch, and that's going to be your main carry, you really want a Guinsoo. It's one of Twitch's most important items. So early Guinsoo as well as other AD items can typically lead yourself towards Experiment because it's one of the less conditional AD comps. However, there are many good win cons. Having a frying pan or a spatula, either to make a bruiser emblem or an experiment emblem, can cap out the board extremely high. So a lot of times if you're in a galaxy or an encounter where you get spatulas and frying pans, this is a comp where you can make use of both of them and it spikes your board significantly and gives you many options. Additionally, there's many win conditions. Something like Unleash the Beast is a win condition that you just play Urgot reroll. It's very strong, and often you could force towards Urgot reroll, especially if uncontested, and it's a free top 1, top 2, top 3. Also, stuff like Cooking Pot, that was the old way that you would normally have to play Twitch, because Twitch's damage was kind of a bit lackluster in previous sets, but it's still good now, in previous patches, but it's still good now. You can just play Cooking Pot, you use it to make a bruiser emblem and then juice up all your bruisers, and you just have an extremely tanky Mundo around the 6 bruiser front line, which we'll talk about these different variations once we get into some of the boards. Before we get into the boards, I just want to mention the units themselves. So Zyra being a backline unit, there are some versions with Zyra that you play reroll, but typically the main carries that you're going to be playing are Urgot or Twitch. Urgot, typically you're playing an artillerist reroll variation, and Twitch, you're typically playing like a sniper with a large, very strong front line in front of you. So between these two units, that's typically what you're doing. Then you're trying to make a front line out of the other units. Urgot's pretty high roll. I don't think Urgot is super important a lot of times. Now, if you want to play to the max trait of 7 experiment, then you would need 1 emblem and a Warwick. Sorry, I think I said Urgot by accident. Warwick, you usually don't play around Warwick because he's a 6 cost, so you can never really guarantee that he's even going to show up in your game. But if you hit 7 experiment, then you need a Warwick with an emblem, or you need 2 emblems. Something to note is that 7 experiment isn't that massive. I don't think I've ever played 7 experiment and thought to myself, this is a giga instant win out situation. Even though it requires 2 emblems or a 6 cost, is not as strong as something like 10 rebel and 9 scrap. Just to let you guys know, it is a beatable board. But that being said, if the rest of your lobby isn't up to date with that, if it's not like some sort of crazy like loot sub kind of game, it is game winning for sure. So let's go through some of the boards. I'm just going to show a generic high cap board. This is one of the higher cap versions of this board that I have seen, and the idea is that you just play around 5 experiment, and then you make your front line very strong and flexible around multiple different 4 costs. This is a very high cap expensive variation of the board, but this is typically what you aim towards. This is the case with Twitch. We're going to show a couple of Twitch boards first, where I'm going to discuss Twitch as the main carry, and then after that we are going to go through the Urgot variations, because there is also a reroll experiment around Urgot. So when you're playing around 5 experiment, you're typically trying to play Twitch carry here, and Mundo is going to be your main tank. So typically you're trying to go for 2-star Mundo, 2-star Twitch. Experiment gives extra HP, so it's really strong on Mundo. It also makes your board relatively tanky, especially if you play around 5 experiment. When you're playing this board, you're trying to make your front line stall out as long as possible. Elise stuns the enemy carries, and so does Vi. So Vi with Elise helps to compensate for the fact that you don't have a very strong vertical frontline trait. You don't have like 6 Sentinel or 6 Bruiser or 6 Watcher here. But what you do have is a lot of stun. It delays the fight long enough because your Twitch wants to ramp up. If you read Twitch's basic ability, it's basically that he does extra damage with bolts every time he auto attacks. And then his experiment bonus is every 5 attacks deal physical damage to the nearest enemy equal to 15% of their max health. So Twitch, if you give him a lot of attack speed, if you make him auto attack a bunch, you proc his experiment bonus, as well as you proc his increased damage with these bolts that he fires once he actually gets his cast off. So what you really want on Twitch is a Gwinsu. He's an auto attacker. When you read the ability, it just screams, I want to attack as many times as possible. I just want to attack as fast as I can. So you want a Gwinsu on Twitch. If I was up to me, I'd put 2 Gwinsus on Twitch. Now, I don't know where the breaker point is and what the best Twitch items are. A lot of times you have to just make what you can, because it's going to be hard if you're playing flexible to have like perfect items all the time. But typically you're going to put Gwinsu, and then you're going to put some sort of damage item. I really like the build of like Gwinsu, Runans, and Deathblade. I think this is my favorite Twitch build that I see, that I think it performs the best, at least in the games that I watch. Now, there's many debates over you should do this, or you can put like full damage, right? You could go like Twitch with like full crit, which is like i.e. Last Whisper. It's very flexible is what I will say. As long as you have at least 1 Gwinsu, the Twitch is going to melt through enemies, because every 5 attacks that he does, he's basically going to eliminate 15% of the max health on one of the units. So you can just tank bust just based on the experiment bonus alone. It's part of the reason why Twitch is so strong in experiment, but without experiment, he's very lackluster. You really need experiment bonus to make Twitch really do anything. The only other time you can play Twitch without experiment bonus is if you're carrying Caitlyn and 6 Sniper and he's just there for fun, or if you're playing like some variation of like built diff or something where like all your units are really strong. But you always want to use experiment bonus on Twitch. Then you also want experiment bonus on Mundo because you want Mundo to be this impossibly hard to deal with tank. If you have experiment bonus on Mundo and you have like all this extra HP on board, the Mundo's going to live long enough to let your Twitch ramp up the Guinsoo. Here I'm just going to put the build that I like better just for the sake of it. I like starting attack speed with Runans. I like Deathblade, it just got buffed. This does a lot of damage. So typically you're going to carry Twitch. You're going to put Mundo in your front line. Mundo, you can put a variety of items on him because he has so much HP and he heals that HP. A lot of times just putting like insanely strong tank items is good. Something like Warmogs, Dragonclaw, and Bramble would be a viable option in my opinion. But of course you can also put AP items on him that buffs his healing. You can put all sorts of other stuff on him as well. I'm trying to look for Bramble Vest. I'm sorry, I always lose one of the tank items. But you just want to make this Mundo as tanky as possible. Give him as much resistances, as much HP as you can, because you want this Mundo to never die. When you're playing Mundo main tank, your Vi and your Elise work as secondary tanks. When you're thinking about both of them, you just want them to cast because you want them to either stun or do a little bit of chip damage to kind of help out with the rest of your board. So a lot of times when you're looking at these two units, you want to put stuff like Protector's Vow and Adaptive Helm on an Elise because it just helps her to cast. These are items that are frontline items that give mana, right? Protector's Vow gives starting mana, and then Adaptive Helm gives mana if they're struck by attacks. So it just helps the Elise to cast to get these stuns off because these stuns are very important in swaying the outcome of the fight. Additionally, on Vi, you could put mana items to help her get her stun off, but you could also work towards Vi being a secondary carry. So Vi, you could put like melee items on and have Vi do like additional damage for your board as well. With this rendition of the board, it is a bit reliant on hitting a lot of these upgraded. This is a very high cap version. I wouldn't necessarily play around 5 experiment unless you have a very strong front line, but there are many different options to play around Twitch with this setup. You can drop down to 3 experiment and you can play a multitude of different units. Here's an example of me just shoving in a bunch of garbage on the board that all contributes to the idea that you're playing around Twitch. When you're playing around Twitch, what's the main idea that I said before? He's an auto attacker. You want to ramp up a Guinsoo as soon as possible. You want this Twitch to have as much attack speed as possible starting, and you want him to just like auto attack until he gets to a point where he's melting everybody. At one point, when many of the units die, he starts to hit everybody because like he runs out of targets to hit. The way he works is that like he'll target random enemies and he'll do piercing damage that hits through multiple targets. So he has a good opportunity to snipe backline carries. If you get the attack speed high enough and units start to die, then there's less units for him to randomly target, and he eventually converges into killing backline carries and actually like scamming and winning the fight very easily. For that reason, you just want as much frontline as possible. Here's a different variation that I did. This is just playing around different traits. I'm not playing deep into any particular vertical trait, but because Mundo is Dominator, you can play any frontline Dominator, like Mordekaiser would be nice. Even a Blitzcrank, you can just play it to have some extra frontline. You can play additional other pit fighters instead of playing 3 experiment. You can just play like Vi or Gangplank. And then you can also play Echo that gets scraps. So you get scrap shield in. So Echo is just a good tanky unit with a scrap shield that you can put some melee items on or AP items if you have a bunch. And additionally, you can play like Elise because she's usually form swapper. There's other variations like this where you can play around Watchers in your front line, right? You can play a Scar, an Echo, gives you Firelight. They jump around, they waste a lot of time. Garen, which buffs your whole board frontline HP because of his Emissary bonus. And then you get Watcher activated, which is a fairly good frontline trait. And usually you're still trying to play around Mundo and Elise. Additionally, there's other variations you can play if you have an Experiment Emblem. Experiment Emblem, basically what it does is it allows all of the units to duplicate that are on experiment hexes. So when you have an experiment emblem, you're always going to go for 5 experiment. You put experiment bonus on Twitch, experiment bonus on Mundo, because those are your main tanks. If you don't have a Mundo 2 and you're going main tank with Nunu, then you can put experiment bonus on Nunu as well. But then you want to put the experiment hex, like you want the duplicate effect to occur, because when you duplicate, basically your Twitch will duplicate, your Mundo will duplicate, and whatever unit here will duplicate, which in this case I usually put on Vi because she's the most like self-sustaining. You could put on Elise as well, but Elise takes a long time to cast, so typically when she clones herself, the clone doesn't actually get a cast off. I think Vi's a little bit easier at doing that because a pit fighter has a little bit more survivability. But what you want is you want everybody to duplicate. You basically get double Twitch, which increases your backline damage, and then you get double of all of your frontline units. It becomes so overwhelming that it's difficult for people to deal with, and also by making more frontline units with the experiment bonus from the experiment emblem, you make it so your Twitch can ramp up that Gwinsu a lot faster. You basically just duplicate a lot of your frontline units, and it just becomes unbearably difficult to deal with. Experiment Emblem, I think out of all the emblems, it's one of the best performing emblems. It was the same as all the other patches. Experiment Emblem is very strong, and a lot of times if you see an Experiment Emblem early in the game, you almost always take an Experiment Emblem. It streaks you in stage 2, this duplicate effect is strong in stage 3 as well, and then in stage 4, it synergizes really well with the board to just have a huge amount of increased frontline. Now, let's say you don't have an experiment emblem and you're trying to think about experiment hexes to fill. You always need to have experiment bonus on Twitch. That is a given. So Twitch will always have experiment bonus. You always need experiment bonus on Twitch. You want experiment bonus on one of your frontline units because they're both going to help out with their general tankiness to have to be on the experiment hex. So whether if you're going for like Nunu 3-star, that's an opportunity to put Nunu on the experiment hex. If not, you want to put Mundo on the experiment hex always. Besides that, then you have a couple options. Oops, I removed my Nunu by accident. You have a couple options of who you want to put on your experiment hex. Sometimes you put Zyra. Zyra gives the basically makes ability damage bleed for bonus true damage. So basically all your attacks do bonus true damage. True damage bypasses armor and MR. It basically is just that's what true damage means. So it's very strong. It's quite strong, especially against certain boards. Urgot also gives a bunch of attack speed as well as a health shield, so it helps a lot with like Mundo's tankiness to just get a health shield when he already has a bunch of health. And the attack speed is good for Twitch as well. It's not super important, but a lot of times you're either going to put Zyra, Mundo, but a lot of times you put Nunu. Nunu makes it so that you basically just like 3% of your max HP does bonus magic damage. It's quite good because if you have Mundo in, Mundo makes it so that every takedown you gain some HP. So Twitch is going to have a lot of HP, and so is Mundo. So if you have a setup like this with 5 experiment where you have 3 hexes, a lot of times you go Mundo, Nunu, and Twitch, and then you just take the bonus 3% max health bonus damage that all 3 of these units do. The only reason that you go Nunu for damage over Zyra or Urgot is just because Nunu makes a better use of the HP that you get with 5 experiment. Nunu is part of your front line, so having the experiment bonus on the Nunu is going to make it so he contributes more to the front line, which helps the Twitch stack up the Gwinsu. If you put Zyra in the experiment hex, for example, Zyra's getting HP. Who cares, right? Nobody cares. Is Zyra doing damage? No, Zyra's not doing damage, right? She's not doing anything unless you have items for her. Same with Urgot. Is Urgot doing anything? No, unless you have items or you have an Urgot 3. They're not really doing anything. But giving HP to Nunu, who is a bruiser that can make use of that HP, and that scales off HP because it's like the experiment bonus works with HP, it just makes a lot of sense to put experiment bonuses on these 3 if you're playing around 5 experiment. And then if you're playing around 3 experiment, you're basically just stuck to put it on whichever of Mundo or Nunu is your main tank. It's almost always going to be Mundo, and then you just put it between these 2. Now, there is another variation of this. I'm just showing you the 5 experiment variations. Obviously, you can drop down to 3 experiment, and what really matters with this comp, this is why it's so flexible, is that Twitch just needs to ramp up, so all you really care about is your front line being as tanky as possible. Builds like these are quite interesting because until you find a Caitlyn, you can also play around Zeri. 3 Firelight is nothing to scoff at. They absorb a lot of damage, so this Echo unit becomes very tanky, and it synergizes very nicely with the Twitch. So there's a lot of synergies to play around Echo and Firelight. You can play around Watchers, you can play around Vertical Bruiser, you can play around Vi with Pit Fighter, you can play around Dominators. You have so many options that it's just good. That's why it's very flexible. The problem with Twitch is that you're very narrow, that you have to find a Twitch always, right? Twitch is usually your main carry in these setups, and you're not going to be able to pivot very easily out of it. So there is a certain commitment you have to do towards playing Twitch, so that's why you still want to be relatively uncontested. Additionally, Elise is impossible to find a lot of times, and she's really important in these front lines, so that's going to be very difficult for you in a lot of the games. But typically, you're capping out on Caitlyn. Caitlyn, you just want a mana item, and then you just want as much damage as possible. So a lot of times, I'll do a build like this, where I just give her full crit. Additionally, if you have a frying pan, this is the old version of Twitch that you usually would only play Twitch if you had this setup. The idea is very similar to the other ones, except instead of playing deep into experiment, you're instead playing as many bruisers as possible. By playing a bunch of bruisers, you basically stack up a huge amount of HP. If you have the bruiser emblem, then you put that on the Mundo. By putting the bruiser emblem on the Mundo, you get an absolutely absurd amount of HP on Mundo. Mundo scales really nicely off his HP. It did get nerfed, but it's still quite strong. And then Mundo becomes a Giga Tank, in addition to the rest of your front line being very strong. This allows your Twitch to ramp up very easily because you have an impenetrable front line that's just a wall of units. And this was the old way to play around Twitch. You usually would only play Twitch if you had a bruiser emblem. These other lines became more viable because of some of the buffs that happened to the units in the experiment line, as well as some of the auxiliary units that can now work as nice frontline options. Now, something to note about Twitch. I talk about this in my positioning guide. The problem with a lot of these boards is not necessarily these situations. It's the fact that it's very easy to position against Twitch. Twitch, like I said before, the experiment bonus is very massive. It's a huge chunk of Twitch's damage. So you can't really play Twitch without experiment. It's kind of tied together. If you play Twitch without experiment, you have to have a really good reason to. You have to be really deep into the vertical sniper trait, which is often very risky because you sacrifice frontline for more damage. Or you have to be like, you know, I don't know, like you have to be like built diff or something. If you don't have experiment bonus, the Twitch really feels lackluster. So what that forces is that it forces your Twitch to always be placed on an experiment hex. The experiment hexes are predetermined. Often there's going to be one in the center of the front line, so there's always going to be one in the front line that you can easily put the Mundo in. But the back line is either going to be in one of the far corners or one of the close to far corners. Sometimes it happens here. Either way, you lose a lot of sniper value because if you're fighting an opponent, for example, let's just take an opponent and they have a Heimerdinger, or they have a Zoe maybe, like Zoe, something that can snipe the back line. They can very easily position in such a way that your Twitch is not getting as much sniper value. Normally, if you were playing like Caitlyn carry, you would just position so you get maximum sniper value always. But if you're playing around Twitch main carry, you can't move them because the experiment hexes are stagnant. That's one of the big downsides to playing this comp. If you see people that have very strong positioning tools, you might run yourself into a very difficult situation late game. That's why you really want to play this if you have a good spot for it and you have some HP. I always say this, I'm like a broken record, play the comp if you have a good spot. It seems very second nature, but I'm trying to explain why you might want to consider not playing Twitch. It's because of these situations where people have boards that can just like completely destroy you. Like for example, if they have Black Rose that I put in here, this Scion, they just put it right in front of the Twitch. Twitch spends all his time hitting the Scion. Scion dashes over here, right? I can't make it happen, right? But Scion dashes right in front of the Twitch. You get no sniper value. This guy's just stunning your Twitch and you just lose the fight for free. No matter how strong your board is, you just lose on the spot. So what ends up happening a lot of times is in order to cap out your board late game, right? So mid game, right? These boards that I'm showing you, they are very strong and it's good to play for a top 4. If you're trying to play for a first though, that's why you really need a Caitlyn too. If you don't have a Caitlyn, you can't protect yourself against people that position in such a way that absolutely destroys your board because of the experiment hexes. They always know the best positioning for you because your Twitch is stuck to stay in the experiment hex and you can't really sacrifice it. Late game, what that allows you to do though with a Caitlyn too is that you can position the Caitlyn to deal with this, right? Your Twitch becomes kind of like, you know, a scapegoat a little bit of sometimes, but if you have a Caitlyn that does an insane amount of damage, then you can play around the Caitlyn to position in a better way. A lot of times you'll see people put Caitlyn on one side of the board and Twitch on the opposite side of the board for that reason. Because instead of just trying to burst down the same unit and use these as a united front, you instead split the difference so that the Caitlyn is able to make proper use of the sniper trait if they position their carries in such a way. Now, that was everything I have to say about the Twitch board. Now we're going to talk about Urgot. So Urgot is another variation of this board that you can play. Urgot, typically you're going for 3-star Urgot. This is a rendition of playing around Artillerist. There are many different Artillerist boards. You can play Artillerist with 4 Sentinel. You can play Artillerist with 4 Bruiser. But if you're playing Urgot carry or if you're playing Experiment Urgot, then you want to play a variation like this where you're just playing around Artillerist and Experiment. Now, what you're always pairing when you pair these two is Urgot with Zyra. So in this case, Zyra is very strong. It's just like in a lot of those other boards, it's hard to pair up Zyra because you lose some front line, and the front line is usually more important for Twitch. In this case, your front line is entirely this Urgot, and you kind of want him to get hits and cast his ability. you care way more about just doing more damage, and the best way to do the damage is with the true damage. This combination is very broken, so a lot of times if you're rerolling Urgot, it's always pair it with Zyra. So what you do is you just play this type of board, 3 experiment, you play these extra form swappers that can work to cap out your game late, and Bruiser, and then you usually go for Tristana 3, Urgot 3. Sometimes you can play this variation without these extra units, and you could play, like, for example, like a Set 3, works out very nicely because he's a 2 cost depending on the type of lobby that you're in. If you have Prismatic Ticket, you might want to gather some more 2 cost units, but there's many variations. This is the one that's like the typical, like, you know, put in your team planner and figure it out later type of beat. When you're playing this board, you just want Urgot to have as much frontline tankiness as well as AD as possible. So a lot of times the go-to build is something like Bloodthirster, Sterex, and Titans. On Tristana, you just want her to have a ramping up attack speed a little bit, and then you can just build her with either damage amp or full crit. Something like IE is what a lot of people like. Gold Collector, Artillerist, Vertical Artillerist traits, or Artillerist augments could all work towards this. The thing that I want to mention is that this comp is very forcible if you hit Unleash the Beast. Unleash the Beast, you just spam as many Sterex as possible on this dude. The way Unleash the Beast works, I'll go back to it because I think I had it on a slide right before. Unleash the Beast, you gain a Sterex gauge. When it figures, you gain attack speed, and then you're immune to CC. It is absolutely absurd how strong this is on Urgot. It's basically game winning in a lot of situations. So if you see Unleash the Beast and you have a spot that you think you can play around Urgot, you basically just spam Sterex gauge on the Urgot, and this is like a top 1, top 2, top 3 comp, depending on if you can hit in a timely manner. So obviously make sure your spot is good, but this is like the go-to if you see the augment Unleash the Beast. Now, those are all the boards. I'm not going to go deep into like the other artillerist examples because, you know, that's probably another video where I talk about artillerist, but that's typically what you're playing when you're playing experiment. Of course, you always, I say this, I stress this as much as I can, one of the best augments you can ever hit is experiment emblem. Experiment emblem on stage 2, experiment emblem on stage 3, it is a very strong augment because the duplicating effect is so powerful for all these different boards. Of course, you know, if you're playing it and you play 5 experiment, that's fine. You can cap out very high around 5 cost. That's what this board is. But there are many variations. I don't want you guys to pigeonhole yourself into thinking this is the optimal Twitch build. Mostly all you care about is, can my frontline sustain my Twitch until my Twitch gets his Gwynsu to pop off? And if it can, then you're fine. If it can't, you have to add more frontline. That's typically how Twitch builds go. That's why it's very flexible, but at the same time, you need to find the Twitches. So if you're very contested, it doesn't matter how flexible these frontline units are. If you don't have any damage in your backline, you're still going to go bot 4. But with Experiment Emblem, you just get so much value. Early game, you basically just win out. Like if you have Experiment Emblem and an Urgot, like in your early game, you just have extra units on your board, you win stage 2 most likely. Usually streak stage 2, streak stage 3, you have so much gold, you just go fast 9, or you have so much gold to roll on 8 that you guarantee upgrade all your experiment units. Experiment Emblem also late game is a very high cap. It gives you potential to hit maybe 7 experiment if you luck yourself into a Warwick, or you can also play around the Experiment Emblem just to get like a bunch of extra stuns on a high cost unit like a Vi or an Elise. So Experiment Emblem is a really amazing thing if you see it, and you shouldn't sleep on it. And just in case people don't know, I just want to make that very clear. If we're talking about early game boards, with this board, you can basically play anything. You can start with an early sniper build. If you're playing around AD frontline units, you can also play around like a Darius. Basically, anybody who wants to take attack speed or AD items early, you can play in your early game and then transition into Twitch late game. This is one of the this was one of the comps that has less conditions when you're playing AD as opposed to some of the other comps. So it's quite reliable, and it should be like more of a default board that you should like first consider, like, okay, can I play Twitch here? Yes or no? Do I have a spot for something better or something worse or something more risky? This is more of like the safety blanket of AD comps. The only time you can't really play it is when too many people are contesting it, because as it's your safety comp that you can play for AD, it's also everybody else's. So if there's a lot of people in your lobby that have AD items, you can expect them to usually just play around Twitch these days. Additionally, if you have artillerist openers, so something like Urgot with Tristana, or an experiment opener where you actually get like a couple experiment units, and maybe you have like an experiment emblem that you can make use of. I'm trying to find a thing. Experiment emblem. I just put a random Scar. Don't worry about Scar. I'll put in a proper unit here. Let's put in a Violet. Right, let's say you have like a experiment opener where you could play around experiment. Then you can also play around the vertical experiment very early in the game, and this will be very strong for you to make it to a very high cap. Tristana can hold Twitch items, so you don't even have to commit to Tristana Urgot reroll, but even in these cases, without Unleash the Beast, if you find a lot of Tristanas and Urgots, you can also play Tristana and Urgot in your mid game and even reroll them. What I'm saying is you have the option of both. So it's very strong. If you see stuff like Urgot Tristan in your opener, you should try and play around it because you have a lot of options around those units. So they're very high value to hold on to. For the same reason, a lot of other people hold on to them. So, you know, it's hard to hit them in terms of like committing reroll on them, which is what I would say is a big downside currently. So finally, we're going to go through the couple conditions for success for the comp. I spent a lot of time explaining like the different boards. Hopefully it was clear, but it is a very flexible comp. I don't want you guys to get pigeonholed, like I said before, into thinking like this is the optimal, this is what I play every single game. It's more so like whatever you hit on your roll down, you should try and make a reliable front line out of it. Hopefully your main target is to hit the Twitch 2 obviously, and the Mundo 2, right? These are your main targets, but after that you can make things work. As long as you have like a stable front line, the Twitch is going to do a good amount of damage a lot of the time. So what you usually want is a strong early game. Because you're playing around Twitch, you don't want to be in a spot where you're in dire straits, because if you're contested or if you don't hit the Twitch instantly, sometimes you just die very easily. You want to have enough gold or enough HP to give yourself the chance to upgrade those units, because the Twitch needs to be upgraded because you're playing very narrow in terms of one carry that you're possibly playing. Your front line's very flexible, but your carry is very narrow, and that's a probable downside that you'll face. Additionally, you want to be relatively uncontested for the same reason. Some of the win cons are massive: Experiment Emblem, Bruiser Emblem, Unleash the Beast, Mutation Survives. There's a lot of conditions where they buff you significantly. Usually it's Experiment Emblem and Unleash the Beast. If you hit one of these win cons, a lot of times you can play towards Experiment and be relatively carefree in how things work out, because you're going to be fine. You want to have gold for roll down. Like I said before, it relates to the other traits. It's mostly because you just need a Twitch, right? The worst feeling is if you're trying to play around this board and you make a Guinsoo and then you don't hit a Twitch. Because Guinsoo, it's okay on some units, but really, who else is it good on, right? It's not that good on anybody except Zoe, but that's a really hard pivot to play towards Zoe. It's not that good on Corki if you're trying to flex AD. It's not very good on a lot of other units, even the 5 cost. It's not even good on Caitlyn. Caitlyn usually just wants mana. She doesn't attack that fast. So unless you, like, if you're making items towards Twitch, sometimes you run into situations where you have a hard time in your mid to late game if you don't hit the Twitch. And that's why you need to make sure that you're either relatively uncontested or you have a lot of gold, because finding the Twitch is going to be very important. You should be able to find it, but I always err the side of caution, because it's very hard to like get out of a bad spot if you don't have a Twitch. Additionally, you want good econ to cap out on high cost units, and if you're re-rolling Urgot, you want to be relatively uncontested. When I say cap out on high cost units, like I said before, because of the experiment hexes, late game it's very easy for people to position around you, especially if there's only like, you know, 4 or 5 of you guys left. Then in a lobby, when people scout, they will be able to easily say, okay, I just have to put my units in front of Twitch, he gets no sniper value, GG, easy. What you really want is other damage dealers, something like Jace. So if they clump in front of your Twitch, the Jace can just melt all of them with the form swapper and other items. Or you want a Caitlyn that you can put on opposite side, so that if they clump on one side, the Caitlyn gets sniper value. If they try and avoid the Caitlyn, the Twitch gets sniper value, and then they're doomed if they do, doomed if they don't. You have a really good spot for that. Anyways, that's the video. Make sure to like and subscribe. I'm still working on some of the other guides. I know I've been delaying doing the anomalies and the augment guides. It takes a lot of work. I'm trying to plan out how many videos of multi-part series I make out of them, because I still want them to be as informative as possible. And with patches changing and stuff, it's hard to keep up with me making a condensed video on those topics. But they're coming soon, as I have a spare chance. I've had a very busy weekend as well. I'm trying to get my art store open. We reached our subscriber goal of 5,000 subs. The next goal will be 10,000 subs. I'll announce it soon. But for 5,000 subs, I'm launching my art store, and I'm going to give away like coupons for it, or like a general coupon code for everybody. So please look forward to that. That's what I've been working on this weekend. And yeah, make sure to like and subscribe. Enjoy your day. See ya. Bye-bye.